All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. My name's Aaron Grade. I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team here at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to the note in the chat box. Audio is disabled for all participants, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Elisa, who is our technical support person today. Also, please note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. I'll kick off our webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Earth System Processes chapter's authors. Next slide. So, the U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 15 agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide. The same law that the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or NCA. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. The NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policy making, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and educators, just to name a few. Next slide, please. The NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. Actually, sorry, can you go back one slide? I think we skipped ahead one forward. Thank you. So NCA5 was written by 500 authors, 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive and doesn't advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine the risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process involves extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or NASEM, and several government science reviews. All right, next slide, please. Now we're going to take a look here at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview and is followed by 2 chapters, including this one, dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then there are the national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although response actions are also discussed throughout the report. NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features on compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. We have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. All right, now that we've gone through some introductory background, it is my pleasure to introduce Ruby and Adam, who are the chapter leads of the Earth Systems Processes chapter and will lead us through the remainder of the webinar today. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Aaron. So let me introduce myself again. So my name is Ruby Leung from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And here together with me is Adam Torrendo from US Geological Survey. So we are co-presenting this webinar. So together with many co-authors, Adam and I developed Chapter 3 to discuss Earth system processes that play important roles in climate change. Earth system here refers to the atmosphere, land, oceans, and cryosphere. And we know that they interact a lot. Together, they cycle energy, water, and essential elements of life, such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So similar to other chapters, chapter 3, we structure this chapter around key messages, and we emphasize new advances or insights gained since the last National Climate Assessment Report that was published in 2018. Our chapter has 5 key messages which address the following questions here. So the first question, are humans causing Earth's climate to change? And how much global warming can we expect for every doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? And how are humans changing Earth system processes and climate extremes? So together, by answering these questions through 5 key messages, we synthesize the recent advances in climate science. So chapter 3 provides the evidence base for chapter 2, which focuses on climate trends. And we also provide the evidence base for other chapters, the rest of the NCA5, which include topical areas as well as regional chapters. So with that, we are going to dive into each of the 5 key messages and provide a little bit more context and information. So the first key message over here. So first of all, we know that climate change at the global scale occurs primarily as a response to processes that change the balance between the incoming solar energy and the outgoing energy radiated from the Earth at the top of the atmosphere. So there are many drivers of climate change, and they can be both natural and human caused, and they can be also transient or long-lived. So in the first key message, we emphasize that human activities, primarily emissions of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel use, such as carbon dioxide, have unequivocally caused the global warming observed over the industrial era. Changes in natural climate drivers had globally small and regionally variable long-term effects over that period. So let's take a look at a figure that tells us a little bit more how we arrive at this conclusion. Okay. So over the past, since the pre-industrial period, we know that the Earth as a whole globally average has warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is what we show here, comparing the observed warming between 2010 and 2019 relative to 1850 to 1900. So using climate models, we are able to break down this global warming from the contributions of different factors. So here in this second panel, we are repeating this bar over here, showing the observed warming of about 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the time period of the industrial era. And breaking this down, we see that there is significant contribution of warming of about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And this warming is coming from well-mixed greenhouse gases, and these include the majority of that would be carbon dioxide, but also include methane, nitrous oxide, and so also some other halogenated gases. And so these are really contributed to the major warming. But on the other hand, there are also anthropogenic factors that are contributing to cooling. And so this cooling include the effects coming from aerosols. These are tiny particles in the atmosphere, ozone, and also land use change. And so because of the offsetting effect, we come to this value of about 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. And if we look at natural factors like solar and volcanic drivers, as well as natural variability, these are really not contributing to the warming, although they contribute to the variability over the period that we have been talking about. So we can also break it down and look at it in a little bit more detail over time, right? From 1850 to about now. And again, you can see here we show the observed warming. There are lots of fluctuations. These fluctuations are partly due to natural processes, but some of these fluctuations are also caused by, for example, volcanic eruption. But overall, we see significant warming contributed by the well-mixed greenhouse gases. As mentioned before, a lot of that is because of carbon dioxide. And then we also see these offsetting effects of cooling. Many of that come from aerosols. As it's interesting to see that the warming due to well-mixed greenhouse gases just keep continuing, whereas we see a little bit of saturation of the cooling effects. And because of that, we are actually seeing the warming to be accelerating because of this uh, capping of the cooling effect. Overall, again, the emphasis is that other factors such as natural processes like solar and volcanic eruption, they are really not contributing to the global average temperature or the warming that we have been seeing. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Adam to talk about the second key message.
Great. Thanks, Ruby. So the second key message really gets into a pretty significant advancement in the climate science that we've seen over the past few years since NCA4. And so one aspect of that and one we highlight in this key message is the fact that the estimated range of climate sensitivity to increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, specifically doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, has narrowed by 50%. So our range of warming, that range of how much warming we would expect, has decreased. Okay. So we have more confidence in how much warming we would expect given how much more greenhouse gases we would emit into the atmosphere. So you can see the key message there. So the estimated likely range of warming expected from a doubling of atmospheric carbon dioxide was reduced by 50% to between 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit and 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Next slide, please. And this really, there's about four lines of evidence that have really improved our understanding of this change in our estimate of climate sensitivity to increasing greenhouse gas emissions and concentrations. A big factor is better understanding of feedback responses to increasing concentrations of these greenhouse gases. So when we've been able to better understand, for instance, things like how strong is the water vapor feedback, which is a positive feedback in the climate system. And then you can see here we have listed all the primary feedbacks that really add up to the overall effect that we would see from doubling carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then what would be the change in the Earth's radiation or energy budget at the top of the atmosphere. So negative feedback in general is just something that when you have some perturbation or some forcing that's acting on a system, feedback is then a response in another part of that system that can either amplify or dampen the initial forcing. So negative feedbacks would result in less net warming overall. Positive feedbacks would result in more net warming overall. And so we've been able to really improve this estimate of the climate sensitivity based on things like this better understanding feedbacks, the process understanding, as well as then understanding how state dependent those feedbacks are. So sometimes the pattern of warming that we've experienced recently results in not as much warming as we would expect from a feedback that will get stronger in the future. And so we do expect that, for instance, in really important places like the equatorial Pacific and the Southern Ocean, we would expect those to turn into more strongly positive feedbacks in the future. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so this is showing this advancement that we've talked about. And this is why this is kind of a step change in in how the science has advanced. For really the last 40 years or more, we've had about the same estimated range of climate sensitivity, again, to this key metric scientists use, this doubling of carbon dioxide concentrations. How much warming does that result in? But again, based on the unprecedented quantitative synthesis of, I'm just reading off the slide now, evidence from observed changes over the recent decades, paleoclimate data, this process understanding, and then a new approach that's been used in the last few years called emergent constraints, which is basically a statistical and approach to better understand the variability that we see across climate model results. And then you relate that to some metric of the climate system and observations. You sort of synthesize all that information to get a better understanding of how the Earth system is probably going to respond to this change in greenhouse gas concentrations. You take all those lines of evidence, and we've really been able to narrow that range of sensitivity. Why do we care about this? We care about this because we want to know how sensitive the climate is as we add more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and as those carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases stay up in the atmosphere, that then lets us know, like, well, how strong of warming are we expected to see, and then what's the nature of the impacts that would result of that. So from a policy perspective, it is really important to understand how sensitive the climate is, given that humans are now influencing the climate by adding greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Okay, next slide.
All right. So before we dive into the last two key messages, which are both about how humans are changing the Earth system, including the Earth system processes and extreme events. So here we would like to highlight the third key message, which is important to highlight some of the advances that have been made in climate science that allow us to give us better ability to understand and model the human influence on the Earth system. So here, the key message really emphasize a few things over here. So a number of scientific developments have enabled deeper understanding of climate processes and their responses to human influence. So the first one is observational records. So observational records have lengthened over time as data keep accumulating, and then new observing systems have come online. So here we are talking about the continuing measurements collected by, for example, instruments on top of on satellite, or also ground-based measurements. And then there are also new observing systems, such as using drones. So these are all some of these advances that I talk about in chapter 3. And then besides observational records advances, we also talk about new scenarios of socioeconomic development and their associated emissions and land use changes drive updated climate projections from Earth system models. So I will elaborate on this using a figure later. And then the third one highlights large ensemble simulations from not just a single model, but from multiple models, have enabled scientists to better distinguish anthropogenic climate change from natural climate variability. And I will talk about that as well in using a figure. And then more targeted model evaluation techniques are using observations to narrow the estimated range of future climatic changes. So here we are now able to use many different types of model evaluation techniques, including the emerging constraint that Adam just talked about, and then also using newer methods to track different types of features simulated by model and in the observation, like tracking extreme events such as atmospheric rivers. And then finally, there are advances made in the methods for extreme event attribution, which enable scientists to estimate the contributions of human influence to some types of individual extreme events in near real time. So here we talk about advances in the methodology that are now being used to do extreme event attribution, which really allow us to look at a broader range of different types of extreme events. As we all know, lots of hurricanes, heat waves, and different types of extreme events can now be attributed in terms of how much are the contributions coming from the human influence on those specific extreme events. So here I like to just highlight some examples over here. So in this example, we particularly talk about the advances made in terms of developing new scenarios. And this is actually a process that involves several different steps. So the first step is to develop these shared socioeconomic pathways. And so these pathways range from sustainable pathways, which we call sustainability, to pathways that are more focusing on fossil energy use. We call them fossil fuel development. So there are 5 such scenarios from SSP1 to SSP5. So after developing the shared socioeconomic pathways, then we also need to consider the assumptions regarding realistic climate policy goals in terms of how we mitigate climate change. And so this would include various scenarios related to climate mitigation. And after these socioeconomic scenarios are developed and they are used in integrated assessment model, which are models that connect the economics, the energy systems, land systems, and also climate to generate these SSP-based scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions as well as land use, land cover change. And then finally, having these scenarios developed by integrated assessment model, then scientists use Earth system models that allow us to then project how climate will be changing in the future. So there have been a focus particularly on 4 different scenarios. They are called SSP1 to SSP2 and 3 and 5. And for each of these SSP scenarios are associated with a particular warming level related to the forcing at the end of the century, like 2.6 watts per meter square, all the way to 8.5 watts per meter square. This is corresponding to very high emission scenario. And so now climate scientists are able to use Earth system models, not only causal resolution models, but also in recent advances, we are able to use higher resolution models such as 25 kilometer to project future climate changes. And then another highlight over here is related to the large ensemble simulations that we talk about in the key message. So large ensemble simulations are performed by perturbing the initial condition of the climate simulation. So similar to what we call butterfly effect, as you perturb the initial condition for the climate model, it would result in a range of different pathways or evolution of the climate system, because the climate system, similar to the weather system itself, has these butterfly effects. And so by performing large ensemble simulations, we can then look at the past as well as looking at the future. So in this figure here, we are showing the observation of the warming for the wintertime surface air temperature based on observation between 1972 to 2021, showing generally warming across the country. Using the observed forcing, such as the amount of greenhouse gases and the land use, land cover change, and aerosols, etc., we can run the climate model many times. In this case, the climate models was run 100 times by perturbing the initial condition. And so we can end up with 100 different simulation of the past warming. And you can see that the plausible model range of the warming can be, you can get one ensemble member which produce larger warming, and then an ensemble member where the warming is much smaller, and in fact actually even some area might be exhibiting small cooling. But overall and on average, this is what we get from the 100 ensemble members, is a warming pattern that is quite comparable to the observed. So here you can see the range of warming. The observation is shown over here, whereas the 100 ensemble member essentially capture this observed warming over here. And then using the 100 ensemble members to project the future, again, you can also see between 2022 to 2071, some ensemble members can project much larger warming than others, but overall, the average warming represents the ensemble mean or the most plausible warming scenario that is projected for this particular time period. So the large ensemble simulations are really useful, a really important tool for us to better distinguish the warming that is driven by anthropogenic forcing, like carbon dioxide, and also the fluctuation that might come from natural variability. So now I move over to key message 4 and hand it over to Adam.
Okay, so yeah, key message 4, this is when we get to some of the processes that are being changed due to human influence on the climate system. So human activities cause changes throughout the Earth system, including the land surface, cryosphere, ocean and atmosphere, and carbon and water cycles. So the magnitude and for some processes, the direction of these changes can vary across regions, including within the US. So climate change does not mean all unidirectional changes for across the globe. There will be variability. And so these changes also occur against a backdrop of substantial natural climate variability as well, which gets similar to a little bit what Ruby was talking about on the last slide. So next slide, please. So this is an example of one thing we're talking about, one of these if we're in the UK, I think we call it a knock-on effect. So as the climate warms, extreme precipitation events become more intense and make up a larger fraction of total precipitation, while the smaller precipitation, less intense precipitation events become less common. So there's a couple of things going on here. One is just that a warmer atmosphere will be able to have more water vapor in it, will have more water vapor in it on the average. And so that means that then there's sort of that juicier atmosphere, there's some consequences of that. And in general, you get these sort of moist inflow. So in stormier areas, you kind of get this sucking of moisture out of other areas as well. So you have this juiced up atmosphere and you can take more moisture from other areas. And that results in when it does storm, you get more intense rainfall, more intense storms. And also in the other areas from which that moisture was coming from, you tend to get fewer of those showers and less intense rainfalls. So overall, the net effect is that average precipitation, the average, say, annual amount of precipitation over the whole year may not change that much. It's just that the distribution changes, where you're getting more of these really short, intense rainfall events, these precipitation extremes, which of course have a lot more impacts on society, when it comes to flash flooding and things like that. And then you're also getting fewer of the less intense rainfall events. So this is one of those sort of consequences of climate change that we have pretty high confidence in the mechanisms for what's driving it and what's causing it, and then why we are seeing and would expect to see even more intense rainfall events in the future in terms of the frequency of the different types of storm types that we get over time. Next slide. Okay, so this is showing then how carbon dioxide is getting taken up and put back into the atmosphere and sort of cycled around the Earth system. And so this is illustration showing the overall global carbon budget and how humans are adding a lot of carbon to the atmosphere every year. So you see that's we're digging up basically stored sunlight and using it for energy, and that gets put up in the atmosphere. Some of it stays for a long time in the atmosphere. But then the Earth system, different reservoirs, different parts of the Earth system will then take up some of that carbon dioxide as well, whether that's from vegetation on land or whether that's from the oceans. Both chemically and biologically, there are different ways that the ocean system takes up carbon. So overall, then you can see that we have this worked out to a pretty accurate at this point, like where the carbon is getting pushed around throughout the Earth system. And there's that imbalance right now where a lot of it is sticking up in the atmosphere for a while. Some of it's getting taken up by the land and the oceans. And we have about the same proportion right now of carbon that keeps getting taken up by the ocean and the land. even though the absolute amount of carbon we're putting in the atmosphere keeps increasing over time. Okay, next slide. And so in keeping with sort of what is the evidence base for the types of changes we're seeing? So this is showing then the ocean and cryosphere and coastal processes responses to a warming planet. So as the planet warms, you have all these different consequences for things like snow cover, ice melts, ice sheet changes, and then also changes in ocean, both biological changes and physical changes and chemical changes. Okay. So all these things then have different effects on the planet and things that matter to us humans. In particular, I just wanted to highlight here, given what I'll talk about in the next slide, the things that are affecting sea level rise. Okay. So that's things like meltwater from glaciers and from ice sheets. And then also there's an effect too, just from the ocean volume increasing overall as it warms. So you have those things that then affect the overall amount of sea level rise. And you go to the next slide. And then that affects coastal flood exposure. Okay. And so then this is showing all those different processes that get very complicated and complex, and that then show that there's a lot of variability in sea level rise when you get down at the local level. And all these different things can then affect how much localized sea level rise you would expect, and also what form that takes. Are you expecting do you see the most impacts during storm surges? Like if you're on the East Coast and we get hurricanes a lot, that would be a time when you would expect the rising overall level of sea level rise. How does that translated locally due to local, say, geomorphology of the land surface, and we have land subsidence and things like that? Or is it a hard coast or a marshy coast? And then also just the tides, like overall localized tidal effects can then influence how much of like what we call those intermittent tidal coastal flooding events, and those become more frequent over time in areas where the tide levels are really fluctuating a lot along the coast. And that's the interaction of the coastal geology, geomorphology, and geometry within the tidal effects and the overall rising levels of the ocean. Okay, next slide. All right, so I think this is the final one on this one. And so here what we wanted to call your attention to is just that temperatures are really rising almost everywhere across the planet now. But that warming is not uniform, okay? And we would not expect it to be. There are different aspects of the Earth system that then affect the amount of warming you would expect. And the feedback processes that I talked about earlier then come into play when we talk about regional amounts of warming. We have this effect called Arctic amplification, where and this has been a really well-founded result for many decades now, something scientists have predicted, in which we are seeing where we get more warming in the Arctic due to different feedback processes that are occurring there, not just something called the albedo effect, which you might have heard of in terms of the reflection of solar radiation back out to space. And as you get darker surfaces, i.e. less snow cover, you get more absorption of heat and energy. And so that causes more warming. That's a really important one, but there's other feedback processes as well in the Arctic that are driving that Arctic amplification effect. And you can see that then in Alaska with the increased temperatures that we see there relative to the rest of the US. So there is warming almost everywhere on the globe around the planet now, but that warming is not uniform. It varies by region. Okay.
All right. So Adam talked about all these various changes in the Earth system, like the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the cryosphere, that we would be experiencing as the global temperature continue to rise. But also importantly, we recognize that extreme events have a lot of impacts on society and humans and ecosystems. So here, our fifth and last key message is about how humans have been changing weather and climate extremes. So here we emphasize that human activities are affecting climate system processes in ways that alter the intensity, frequency, and or duration of many weather and climate extremes, including extreme heat, extreme precipitation and flooding, agricultural and hydrological drought, and also wildfire. And we have medium to high confidence in that. And partly because a lot of these changes in extreme events are really tied back to two fundamental processes. One is the energy, right? The heat. As the earth warms up, there's a lot more energy, and that energy can drive wildfires, it can drive heat, heat wave, etc. And the other process are, is related to the increase in the energy is that as the temperature warms, the atmosphere can hold more moisture. And so that increase in the moisture also is, as a matter of fact, is a form of energy as well. It's called latent energy. So that together, combined with the temperature, can cause a lot of these changes in the extreme heat, precipitation, flooding, drought, and wildfires that we are talking about. So here I would like to show maybe like two examples. The first example is about drought. And here we talk about the climate drivers of drought and how that ultimately can affect the different three different types of drought that we usually use to denote drought condition. So climate drivers include like precipitation, radiation, temperature, wind, and humidity. So as we know, as climate warms, these are all going to be affected one way or another. And so these changes in the climate drivers will then go down and affect many different types of processes at the land surface that include changes in the snowpack, changes in the evaporative demand and the vapor pressure deficit, as well as the actual evapotranspiration coming from the soil and as well as coming from the plants. So as a result, that would affect how much water is available in the land surface in the form of stream flow, in the form of groundwater, lakes and reservoirs, as well as in the form of soil moisture, right? So changes in these water availability would then ultimately lead to drought condition. So we talk about three types of drought: meteorological drought, which is mostly driven by changes in the precipitation, whereas hydrological and biophysical drought, one related to the stream flow in the river, and the other one related more to the soil moisture, which is affecting agriculture and crops and plants. And so these are all affected by these multiple processes going down from the climate drivers all the way to the drought condition. So because of climate change, we expect them to be changing in the future. The next example is about compound events. So these compound events is an interesting one, and it is in particular in NCA5 there is actually a special topic that is discussed more extensively in one of the chapter. So here we give an example of these consecutive events, which is part of this what we call compound events. So this happened actually in California between 2012 to 2018. So starting from drought condition in 2012 to 2018, so drought condition makes the soil dry and also less vegetation. But then starting from the winter of 2016 to the spring of 2017, the temperature and the moisture conditions changed quite a bit, and there were also quite a lot more extreme events. One might recall that in spring of 2017 there were a series of atmospheric rivers hitting California. So these extreme precipitation and the generally moisture condition allows more vegetation to grow. But then swinging back to the summer and winter of 2017, heading back to the hot, dry condition. And so we have lots of vegetation, but then these hot, dry condition, particularly with a really strong Santa Ana wind events, that really caused wildfires to spread during that year. And as a result of the wildfire and burning of the vegetation and the soil, that can affect the surface condition. And then in January of 2018, when an extreme precipitation event comes and the precipitation falls on top of the burned area, that can cause debris flow and landslide, etc. So these type of conditions could be changing also in the future because of the changes in the drought, extreme precipitation, and the wildfires altogether. So here we conclude our presentation about chapter 3, just summarizing again. So chapter 3 presents evidence that human activities have unequivocally caused the global warming observed over the industrial era. We also explain how the estimated range of climate sensitivity has narrowed by 50%, and then highlighting how human activities are changing weather and climate extremes. So here I would like to particularly call out our author list. As I mentioned, we have a really great group of co-authors working with us on developing this chapter. So with that, I think we would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much. And thank you, Adam.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that overview of your chapter. It was a lot of great figures in there for people to peruse and a lot of really interesting key messages. And it's clear that the science has definitely advanced since the last NCA came out. So exactly, as Eliza posted in the chat, please put any questions that you have for our panelists in the chat, and I will dive into a couple questions that we received.